growth is a journey. So think long-term, think sustainability.
Hello there, it's me, Steve Mellor, and welcome in to GrowthReady, the podcast that allows high performers to reveal the reality behind what it means to ready yourself for growth, the personal and professional challenges along the growth journey, while also allowing the high-performance executive coach in me to satisfy his curiosity toward what drives optimal performance. On this episode, we welcome in Director of Technology for Amazon Payment Services, Omar Halabieh. And following years of pursuing his passion for mentorship and leading others, Omar has now established an outlook for fulfillment that ensures we discover more that we don't know about ourselves in order to ready us for what's next on the growth journey. Hello there, welcome back in to the most recent episode of GrowthReady. I am so excited to be welcoming in all the way from, we have a new country that we get to check off the countries that we've spoken to, all the way from Dubai. We have Omar Halabieh. Am I saying your last name correct?
Yeah.
Was that right?
Yeah.
Yes, awesome, good. Omar, so excited to have you here with us. We've long overdue, and I'm just excited to be doing it. But before we go any further, tell our listeners what it means to you to be growth ready.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on the show, Steve. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. So it's great to connect and get this going. So for me, I think of to be growth ready is to really think of yourself at all times as a work in progress, whether in terms of who you are and want to become or what you've achieved so far. And I think for me, this has basically, I would say, four different implications, right? I think one is that there's always opportunity to grow in any n number of dimensions. I think the second one is that we can never sort of rest on our laurels. So no matter how much we've accomplished, if we're not moving forward and improving every day, in a way we're going backwards or moving behind. And this ties in some ways directly to also how fulfilled we feel in the journey. I think the third thing is that while at times the growth signals to kind of nudge you in that growth direction may come externally. So let's say you may get feedback from peers, from your manager, et cetera, at work, for example. But more often than not, this has to come internally. Like only you know how much you're challenged or how much potential you have or how much you can grow. So I think that, listening to yourself and being honest and accountable with yourself in terms of driving that is maybe the third. And then the last point I would say is growth is a journey. And so think long-term, think sustainability. I always think of it as if this was a financial investment, it's how do you think long term, lean on consistency and compounding to drive growth versus some get rich scheme kind of thing. So that's, to me at least, how I think about growth. Yeah.
Oh, what a wonderful response. I mean, for me, I'm always looking for my guests to frame certain components of what it is you provide when you provide your initial insight, and you did exactly that without me even having to ask it. Because again, on its own, work in progress could be one of those terms where it's just okay, it kind of means to each of us, it means what it means, and based on our experiences. But then for you to break it down in this, awareness that there's always opportunity. We're never complete. We're never a finished product. There's this internal need for recognition at all times, and then understanding that we're on a journey. And I think in that four-pronged approach to what it means to be a work in progress, it allows me to somewhat segue into what it is you're doing today, because for the past 20 years now, you've been in this position of leadership where either you've been able to recognize that as a leader, you're a work in progress, but at the same time, you're probably responsible for lots of other people that are experiencing you and able to learn from you as to how they're also a work in progress. So I'm sure we'll get to that, but tell us a little bit about the work that you are doing today.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a global technology executive. I have over 20 years of experience. I'm currently Director of Technology at Amazon Payment Services. So I'm basically responsible for the technology that powers payments experiences both within Amazon as well as for external businesses in the Middle East and Africa region. I've been with Amazon for the last 10 years. And before that, I was basically in the energy industry before that and telecom. So that's kind of the breadth of my experience within sort of my day-to-day responsibilities, but also outside of it. I'm super passionate about leadership development, whether self-development for myself, but then also helping others develop their leadership skills and really help them grow their career from that perspective. And that's what I try to do with as much time as I have, both online and trying to scale that as well. Yeah.
Yes, finding time to invest in others. We both share that that desire and are fully aware of the limitations that life can put on us in order to do that as much as we would like to. But I think something that is just abundantly clear here is that, you know, you can't help but acknowledge the fact that you've been part of an organization there in Amazon for the last 10 years, that you talk about a work in progress in itself, right? I mean, it's just a company that is always growing, always changing, always having to adapt. So that four-pronged approach that you talked about there, I mean, you've been in that environment doing the work that you've been doing now, at least for the last 10 years of your career. I'm just curious, straight away, how much is the environment, would you say, plays a factor in the ability to actually show up and be growth ready the way that you described?
Totally. I think it plays a massive role. Maybe the closest analogy I can think of is like literally a plant or some type of crop. Like, obviously there's a lot that comes with you in terms of what you control and what you do individually, but a lot of it is sort of shaped, nurtured, supported by the environment, the soil, the air, the sun. There's so many different factors. To make it practical, like I think there's a few different ways that this manifests itself in the workplace. I think first and foremost, for me, a big part of my own growth has been really finding people in your work environment that you look up to, that you get inspired by, that basically challenge you to become the best version of yourself that can be. So for me, that's one thing that I really sort of, drives me to grow in this respect. When you look at, like, no matter how much you've achieved, we're talking about the work in progress, you can always spot, dozens, if not hundreds of people that in some aspect, shape or form are somewhere that you aspire to be. And so how do you take that, but channelize that in a positive, constructive way in terms of what do I need to do to up my game and get there. So I think that's kind of one way that I feel is there. And again, no matter how much you think you've done, you look around and you find people that are further ahead. So it just keeps you in that mode of maybe thinking and operating. I think the other one is obviously also having access to tremendous resources. And by resources, I mean whether people who are willing to help you, whether, like courses or trainings or sessions, or even just picking people's brain, in different sessions. I think having access to these resources certainly then helps you channel that desire to grow into something you can actually implement. And then the third element of this is obviously the level of challenge that the work opportunities that you get presents you. And I feel that for me, like what's kept me sticking around for the past 10 years is really that continued challenge, that I wake up every day thinking that, hey, there's a new challenge. I want to step up and both grow and learn and then deliver great results. So I think those are maybe three elements I would call that really play into the environment aspect that really help you grow and really inspire you to grow also.
Yeah, awesome insight, mainly because at the heart of it, you're covering both sides of what I always like to acknowledge when we talk about the environments we operate in, the controllables and the things that are out of our control. And those first two things that you mentioned there, very much controllables.
Yeah.
Like there's that desire, as you put it, to want to grow. That's gonna control whether or not you go and find these other people to serve potentially as mentors. It's going to serve as that desire to go and access the resources that you can potentially go and access. And I'm just curious, when you think about that part of the controllable aspect, how do you see that sort of play itself out over the years of work that you've been doing now? Like, how have you seen people show the two sides of that? Like, there's that initiative to go do those sort of things, and then there's that moment as a leader where you need to maybe help someone become aware Like, hey, this is actually in your control. You're just not utilizing what's maybe available to you.
Totally. I think that both for myself and then for many of those that I mentor, I think the key word that comes into this is really what we call like ownership, which is like taking control, having that both not just the drive, but really putting it into action and taking that step. And I think that's what ends up making the difference between like two people being in the same environment, but one that's able to effectively leverage what's around them versus not. I think certainly it requires definitely, aside from just the willingness to do it, definitely requires some level of courage. Like even if you're going, for example, let's say asking somebody to be your mentor, they may not be able to, or they may not accept, or whatever else. And sometimes that fear of, let's call it rejection, or maybe turning away, or maybe you don't get a response or something like that, I think blocks us from taking that step. You may be thinking, even sometimes to yourself, like, hey, these people are probably too busy for me. What can I provide them? Like this kind of mentality. I think the one thing that at least has helped me throughout my career is like, be courageous, step into it. We all sort of face these kinds of doubts, whether internally or maybe externally. But I think it's important to step in and take those shots. And what you'll find is that, again, I think people are much more helpful than you maybe think. And even when they're not able themselves to help, they're at least able to point you in some direction to be able to do that. And certainly, I didn't get to where I'm gotten to so far in my career without help and support from many who, in some sense, I've just had the courage to ask to help me in that respect. So that's kind of at least one of the key, maybe top advices that I give to folks that I mentor and coach around. Just never hesitate to reach out and ask, like, what's the worst thing that can happen? In that regards. And then also, even if you encounter, let's say a rejection or a non-response, doesn't mean you should abandon the approach. Just go and ask the next person and the next person, because all you need is one person to say yes to really help change the trajectory of your leadership development, your career growth, etc.
Yeah, and that's the bridge between those three environmental factors that you initially talked about there. Those first two controllables, it's almost this bridge of courage.
Yeah.
Hey, because the level of challenge, like one of the challenges that can come up is by committing to the first two, right?
Absolutely.
You commit to those first two, and it's like suddenly you are dealing with rejection. You are dealing with somebody maybe letting you down, or a resource that you thought was going to be useful suddenly turns out to be useless. Like you just have no idea. But that desire to understand that, hey, within this environment, I'm actually welcoming challenges.
Yeah.
I want to be an environment that serves adversity in a way, so that I can grow and I can benefit from it. Right?
Totally.
Yeah, and I think that's the idea of courage. I find it's not a word that's used enough in the worlds that folks like yourself are operating in. And I'm just curious, when you think back to some of the first examples of when you can pinpoint, okay, this is when I actually said, you know what, I'm going to take this step of courage. I know that this could end up with me either falling flat on my face or being rejected, because I think as much of what we're talking to is serving our audience, there's nothing better than an example of when you took that first step of courage to maybe help someone who has yet to take that step of courage themselves.
No, I hear you. There's many instances in my career. Maybe one that I highlight is, we were talking about growth and getting that internal signal that maybe you're ready to grow. You could be doing more. I was early on in my career at Amazon. I was managing one single team. And I felt that over the time that I've been managing the team's gotten to a good spot in terms of the talent we had on the team, in terms of how well systems were running, the projects were running, stakeholder engagement was going, etc. And I felt that I could be doing more. I had this internal feeling that, hey, while I'm stretched in my current role, but I think I have more to give than that. But to be honest, I was hesitant, maybe a bit, maybe scared in terms of like, what do I go tell my manager? Do I just tell them like, hey, I don't have enough work to do. Can you give me more? Like, what would they think of me? Maybe what could be some ramifications in terms of how they think about my performance or whatever else. And I know some of these may sound, let's say, in hindsight, like exaggerated, but at the time when I was looking at it, like these were the thoughts that were kind of going on in my mind in that respect. So I was kind of, maybe worried, but these questions kind of kept coming in my head. And I couldn't stop thinking about this topic, knowing that I could be doing more. I could be stretching myself. At the time, obviously, I was very fortunate to have a mentor. And so I decided, like, hey, maybe instead of first going and talking to my manager directly, let me talk to my mentor. Maybe that required a little less courage to do that, since I felt that, hey, I can tell them anything and it's inconsequential in terms of like nothing bad can happen regardless there. So I went up to my mentor and kind of walked him through the situation I was facing, etc. And really, most of what my mentor did was just listen to me, but really gave me the validation and that extra nudge, like that I was thinking about things in the right way and that I should indeed have that conversation. So sometimes it's like you may go with a situation that requires a little less courage, and then from there get the nudge that gives you that confidence to go to the higher stakes situation. And so again, while my mentor in effect like didn't teach me anything new, but he really instilled in me the confidence to go have that conversation with my manager. And sure enough, the next day or maybe a couple of days later, I went and had that conversation with my manager. And the conversation actually culminated, like fast forward, maybe like a month or two later, a sister team of ours, like their manager had left. And then my manager gave me that additional team to manage on top of my responsibility because of that conversation that we had. So this is just one example where literally like that courage to have that conversation literally changed the trajectory of my career. And again, this is just one example, but if I trace back like every inflection point in my career, really it relied on some like crucial conversation that was not comfortable and that required courage for it to be had. Yeah.
Thank you for that story, because there's a couple things that came out of it that are so important for people to hear. One, as you just said there right at the outset, is right as you were finishing, was the inflection points, and we don't give them enough credit. We don't do the work where we go back in time and think about what was that small moment, what was that tiny action that actually led to countless results that have come my way. And it's one of my favorite things to do to this day, Omar. Like, for instance, having you on the show, I can play this game in my mind of how did I get to a point where I got the introduction to Omar? Like, and I could probably go back 5 years down that rabbit hole of how you ended up on this show today. And I think that work is actually the work to now bring it back to another point. You're actually describing courage there on a spectrum. And I think that's really important, because some people will hear the word courage and think of it as an absolute. Either you have it or you don't. And you're talking about it on a spectrum now, which is so important, because that can give someone just enough courage to take a small, tiny step and understand that simply building that relationship with the mentor in the first place and asking them a question, asking a tough question to someone that you trust, that you know is going to hear you, listen to you, respect you based on whatever you're sharing. That is a small act of courage that can lead to, as you put it so eloquently, to that high stakes. It can lead you to that high stake moment so that you can feel like, hey, this is going to take a bigger act of courage. However, I've now received that validation. In other words, that reinforcement to actually step into the courage and step into the risk that comes with that courage, knowing that it could have gone very differently to what it did. But typically, most stories like this somehow end up positive. And that's what I always love about them. It's just like, if you do the work and go back and look at the evidence, most of these stories actually work out positively more so than they work out negatively, right?
Totally. And as you said, like usually it's the culmination of a lot of, effort and hard work that's been piling up for years. But it's that sort of catalyst element that just makes the next step possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to now jump onto something that it's already coming through in abundance, but where you get fulfillment from. You mentioned that in the I think it was the second part of the way you articulated work in progress, that never complete and that desire to be fulfilled. Whenever I hear someone like yourself speak with such clarity on what sounds as though this is what really fills your cup every day, this kind of work, this pursuit of really mastering and understanding how to work with and guide other people. Where does that come from for you? Like, I don't want to go to the origin of it. I'm more curious about today. Like, what is it that keeps that appetite so great for you to keep approaching this area of fulfillment that, is clearly something that you're not getting bored of anytime soon?
Sure. I think for me, the two areas that I feel in terms of like fulfillment and purpose that really kind of have on each other, I feel like the act of learning itself, has this part of like fulfillment that is just in some ways hard to describe. Like, why would you get fulfilled from like learning something new? But it's always fascinating to me, and it could be across really any subject. Like this other day I was reading a book about like weather, like how do clouds form, like just anything. Right. But it's like you get fascinated by like the science behind it, how it works. Like I just find so much fulfillment from just learning, and in of itself, I feel so that like the being able to satiate your curiosity is something that really resonates with me. And of course, it creates this flywheel effect of like, the more you learn, obviously, the more you discover how little that you actually know. And you kind of wander and follow your curiosity from like one thing to another. And you really realize like there's so much to learn, and a lot of these things are interconnected. So it gives you this cycle of like positive growth in that respect. So that's kind of one aspect of it, I feel, in terms of learning. I feel the other aspect of it, and bridged by actually doing, is really that sense of like giving back and helping others. I think for me, like there's in some sense nothing more fulfilling than helping others succeed. And for me is like, aside from my own accomplishment, I just like personal accomplishments, I just feel I get so much more satisfaction from when I see, somebody come back to me and says, hey, you've helped me grow in this area, or because of some support I received from you, I was able to do X. Like that sense of fulfillment, I don't think anything beats that in that respect, particularly when a lot of that also just comes through pure inspiration. So it's not like you told people what to do or whatever, but them just seeing you, following your example, being inspired by the work that you're doing, I feel gives an immense sense of satisfaction as well. So I feel, to me, those are probably the two elements that come together. And I think, as I said, like the middle part that holds it all together is really kind of applying what you learn and living that. Because then between learning, doing, and then serving others, I think that's kind of the flywheel of fulfillment, at least for me.
Yeah. And you've used a word there on the first part of that answer of curiosity. It's something that comes up on this show a lot. Typically, most of my guests are naturally curious individuals, and the way I even speak about it now when I'm doing some of my professional speaking work, when I speak to curiosity, I have a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, and people assume like children, they're the most curious beings, right? And the way I kind of always have said like the difference, because I want to highlight the way you described it, is that, for instance, my 4-year-old son, his curiosity is like, hey, if I were to jump now, is this going to hurt or is it not going to hurt?
Sure.
Right? And then once he lands and decides whether it hurt or not, he's probably going to go on to something that has nothing to do with that and get on with the rest of his day. Whereas, to your point with the curiosity, it's when you learn that first step, are you satisfied by what you've learned that first step? Or do you want to keep going down a said rabbit hole or whatever it may be? And as you said there, something as random as like, hey, how do clouds work?
Sure.
And then before you know it, you're reading about something that maybe you've figured out some crazy way to articulate that this may actually somehow serve me in the work that I do now. And you may be so far removed from that initial act of curiosity, but because of that willingness to eventually say, hey, how do I land an application?
Yeah.
Am I learning for the sake of learning? most people aren't really inspired to do that. But when you suddenly say, no, I want you to go and learn in a way that's going to lead to application.
Yeah.
Well, suddenly now you're a little bit more interested, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's where that's where also transformation happens when you take what you've learned, you apply it, and it helps you grow in some aspect, shape, or form. Whether you as a person, in terms of the role that you're playing, etc. I think is definitely there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second piece of that I think is really important to touch on with the serving others and giving back, and especially in your world, because anyone that's listening to this that is 15, 20 years into what it is they're doing, maybe you make the argument for even less than that. But they're going to turn around and say, Omar, I've got a lot of stuff to do, man. I got a lot of stuff I'm working on. I got all these tangible measurables that need to be delivered upon that I'm being held accountable to. Tell me, convince me why I should be making the time. Because some people will say that they don't have the time. And so my immediate response to those folks always is like, well, how do we create the time?
Yeah.
And so instead of me answering that, I would love for you to maybe just educate our listeners on the importance and maybe the way in which we can actually create that time to do exactly what you're talking to.
Totally. I think there's a few aspects of it. I think the first one is, I always feel like we talk a lot about whether topics like stress, burnout, all these kinds of challenges that we have with what we work and sort of the modern lifestyle, let's say, in that respect. I feel for me, one of the key antidotes, and at least that I've found useful and that works for me, is really linking my work to purpose and fulfillment. Because when I do that, I think it makes my approach to my work more sustainable in that respect. Like, yes, it does take time and effort, but the fulfillment it drives really helps me manage better from a stress or maybe not to burn out, etc. So that aspect I feel is important. I know it's a little bit in some sense counterintuitive, but some time spent there really, really helps. I think that's one aspect of it. I think the second aspect of it is, when whether giving back, teaching others, etc. I think we grossly underestimate how much it helps you clarify and crystallize your own thinking and understanding about all these different subjects that you're talking to others about, whether through the act of trying to explain it, simplify it, communicate it, but also in terms of the questions that you receive from others, maybe their inputs, their perspectives. It helps you, it helps make your sort of knowledge and experience more well-rounded, because it's getting diverse opinions into it. So over time, it kind of melds into your own thinking. So by teaching and by serving others, we learn a lot in the process. So while it may seem it's a one-way, it's actually a two-way in that respect. But as you said, I think, Steve, it comes down to you making the time for it. And again, it doesn't have to be as you said, it's a spectrum. So it's not an all or nothing. Obviously we all have goals to hit and things that we need to deliver, etc. But it's how do you inject it in the right doses for you? And I think here, the consistency and the compounding over time makes a big difference. So it's not like you have to go all in all at once in that respect. But I certainly recommend, trying that and building it little by little. I think, again, the sense of satisfaction that it brings and the sense of clarity and effectiveness that you're able to bring into your role, I think is unparalleled, at least from my experience.
Yeah, and just such a valuable insight. And again, I had to ask that question to you because we don't even need any information about the X's and O's of what you do each and every day. We just need to look at your title and the breadth of just logistically, geographically, however you want to put it, what you're responsible for. So you obviously have tangible, measurable things that you're having to focus on week in, month in, quarterly, all this kind of stuff. And so asking that question, I think, is so necessary for folks to hear your response. The second piece that you provided there is the piece that I think anybody, no matter where you are on your journey, can resonate with, is that this is a two-way commitment and benefit.
Yeah.
That if you understand that if you making the time to give back to someone around something, whether it be something specific to their career, their life, wherever they are, it is going to make you a better version of yourself, whether that be also personal or professional. And again, it's one of my favorite things about this show is that here we are 250 plus episodes in, and every time I get to have a conversation like this, I am better for it. Yeah. You know, again, I know I'm playing the role of facilitator in these moments, and I could just ask a list of 10 questions and go through those 10 questions and say, thank you, Omar, appreciate the time. But the reason I do it the way I do is for everything that you're saying is it allows me to think, okay, the way I articulated what I maybe just asked or wanted to learn from Omar, had I done it that way, well, had I asked a similar question a year ago, I probably wouldn't have asked it the same way, because I'm now better educated on that because of this work that I get to do. And this is work, like being able to sit down and learn from folks like yourself. It allows me to show up as a better version of myself, even though I'm the one who's just really asking all the questions. You know, and I think that's very, very supportive for a lot of people listening to this, I think, who would say, I can't make the time for that, Steve. I'm sorry. But when you suddenly say, okay, well, what if I were to tell you that there was actually something in it for you as much as there is for the person that you're potentially serving in that moment? And then also the compound effect as well. Yeah. You're encouraging people to be patient. You know, you're encouraging people to be patient. And I'm curious, in your world, when you think about and we were joking right before we got started, we both had some pretty significant weeks. We've had a lot going on and all this kind of stuff. And you're late in the evening on a Friday right now where you are. Let's talk about patience for a moment, because so much of this work is long-term focus, compound effect. What role has patience played, would you say, just in when you look at your career as a whole? Like how important has patience been for you?
So super important. I think especially when it comes to, I feel like the longevity aspect of it, because it's easy to, in some sense, completely lean on impatience, and again, try to rush things, do too many things, etc. But you'll quickly find out a lot of the times the hard way that that's not sustainable. And so I think the formula that I've tried to learn from, at least from my perspective, is like, how do you be impatiently patient? Like there's got to be like some impatience in the short run that gets you to do things, to, you know, accomplish your tasks, work on your next goal, etc. But from a strategic perspective, you need to be patient, because the big blocks take time to move. And so how do you kind of couple that impatience in the near term, but then have patience and trust the process, that as you do these things day to day, they will get you where you want to go, maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, there. Because it's easy also to swing it the other way, where, you know, thinking that this is patience, just sitting around and hoping that things, you know, move 2 years, 3 years from now, you know, is probably not the ideal approach either. So I think it's really, how do you balance between the two? But all, as you know, we mentioned many times in the conversation already, I think all the great things sort of take time to get there. And it's usually like, it's almost always like this, you know, the analogy of the iceberg. There's usually a lot building underneath, but then what we see at the surface is a mere kind of slither of what exists down there. So it just takes time to both to develop and then get above the surface as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Patience. I like it. I think that's almost a parenting tool in itself as well. as you start, immediately, I'm only a few hours removed from the school run this morning and all that kind of thing. And so for me, I'm like, man, patience, man. Yeah, that I can see how those two balance each other. But at the heart of that, though, too, what I love about it is the impatient part of it speaks to the ambition and the want, and the desire, right? Yeah. You know, you're acknowledging that this person, you want to see success, you want to see growth. Yeah. So you're right to be impatient. However, to your point too, like, are you going to respect the strategy and the process enough to be able to be patient at the same time?
Totally. And I think the focus on the controllables, I think we talked about it before, I think becomes key in this, because, you know, focus on what you control and be impatient about that in terms of driving the right inputs. But then again, the outputs, which also contain non-controllable factors, you got to be patient with that. Yeah.
Yeah, love it. Let's touch on the third piece of your work in progress definition, the internal recognition.
Yeah,
it's something I've actually spoke publicly about a number of times. Is that, you know, it's one of the most sought after requirements in all data. When you look at all the data in the workplace, people want to be recognized for the work that they do.
Yeah.
And I love challenging audiences and just saying, how well are you doing that for yourself?
Sure.
How well are you recognizing yourself and the value that you bring? So I'm curious, when you present that, firstly, maybe provide us a little bit more context around really what you mean by that. But in addition, I'd love for you to maybe give me an example of how you practice it yourself.
Sure. So I think there's two elements of this, and some of it may be more like, say, directly recognition. Some of it may just be feedback. So at least the way I've experienced this through my career, I think early on in your career, you tend to get very explicit signals, let's say from your direct manager or even from your peers in terms of how well you're doing anything. It could be a paper you're writing. It could be a software you're working, piece of code that you're writing and you're trying to deploy, or anything of that matter. I think in some sense, what most professionals, especially as you get more senior in terms of experience and rank, is that you find that these signals start to fade over time, in terms of like you get less and less maybe direct feedback and sometimes even direct recognition as you move through in your career as well. And so one of the things I always, encourage my team members, those that I mentor, those that I talk to, and it's been my experience and my journey as well, is how do you early on in your journey develop almost like your own compass of how well you're doing? What do you think of the work that you've delivered? Do you think that you're growing? Do you have capacity to do more? Because without that internal compass, what ends up happening is like as that external signal fades, you feel like completely lost. It's almost like being dropped in the middle of the ocean and then you're expected to figure out where to go next. And you haven't developed that navigation capability to understand that. So that for me is like, again, it's like we should always definitely seek feedback. We should hopefully get as much, recognition from, the organization, the leaders we work with, etc. But it shouldn't be the only signal that we rely on there. So think of it like you have your own signal. At times, yes, you do need to calibrate it as you get inputs from others in terms of like whether you're thinking about it the right way or whatever else. But I feel like it's very important to develop your own compass. Otherwise, the sense of both fulfillment and achievement will be elusive if you're only counting on that external element to come through, at least in my experience.
Yeah. It's firstly, you providing a wonderful advertisement for why I do what I do in executive coaching. Again, this is one of the first things I tell anybody that ever considers executive coaching is that when was the last time you received consistent feedback or were challenged by those around you? And it's so true. It's just like, how can you not, as you grow through your career, gain greater and greater responsibility, slowly watch the potential for feedback fade away? Because more people are now, for lack of a better term, beneath you within the organization, and so now they want to sort of somehow satisfy you and maybe feel as though direct feedback is not something that they're as easily able to share with you. And slowly but surely, like you said, you can suddenly find yourself dropped off in the middle of a desert being, when was the last time somebody told me to go left, to go right, to go forward, to go back? And it's a potentially scary place for any leader. I'm curious, when you think about how you've developed that internal compass, I've heard that as a very much a reoccurring undertone throughout this whole conversation so far, is that you clearly have an intuitive awareness of, when to speak or why to speak or if something should be said, etc. How have you been able to truly develop that internal compass over the years?
I think I would say the most high leverage activity in that front, I think, is self-reflection. So I think creating the time and really the mental space for you to reflect on how your day went, how your week went, how a particular meeting went, how a decision that you made went, what can I learn from it, what did it teach me, etc. I think it's that time spent reflecting. And then also as you consume, for example, again, you may be reading a book or listening to a podcast or whatever it is that you're doing, kind of always be thinking about like, how does this relate to how I work or how I think and whatever else. So I think spending that time to really think about how you do things, how you think, how you act, I think really helps over time build your self-awareness. And I think it's always like a work in progress, but I think it's super important to spend that time and effort. It can feel very uncomfortable at first, sitting with yourself, with your own thoughts. At times it could be scary, since we're so connected, we're so driven by like external, inputs and whatnot. But I think that time spent alone just thinking, I think is very important, and giving your brain that break to create that mental space. I always give the analogy of like, it's like eating food and you need to give your body time to digest. I feel like your mind works in a similar way in terms of like, if you're just constantly feeding it information and inputs and stimulus and whatever else, like where is it creating the time to really ingest and make sense of all of these inputs that are coming in? How do they connect with other things that are you doing something well or not? Like all these things, like, so give it some time to do that. I feel for me, for example, taking walks whenever I can helps, bring that, create that space, bring that clarity of thought. But I think whatever works for anyone, but I think it's important to basically give your mind that time and really reflect on what's happening, with what you're doing, because that's the way that you start to develop that sense, I feel.
Yeah. And something you're doing great for us here is you're framing reflectiveness in a way where you're insisting anyone listening here is, why am I reflecting?
Yeah.
It's not reflecting for the sake of it. It's not journaling for the sake of it, for instance.
Yeah.
You're actually framing this in a way where it's like, okay, if I were to reflect, what would I reflect on, and how can I reflect on it in a way where it's going to serve me for doing it? And it's the same sort of filter that you then use when you think about that podcast that you listen to, or think about that book that you're reading right now. My mind immediately went to the way I read versus the way my wife reads. It's like my wife is a fictional reader, so she just will just pile through pages and pages and pages and pages. I've watched her read 50, 60, 100 pages in one sitting. I read like 3 or 4 pages at a time, because I read mainly nonfiction. I read biographies. I read stories of just how has something been achieved, or whatever it may be, and I just read 3 or 4 pages. It has a little bit to do with the fact I do it late in the day and it typically puts me to sleep. But in addition to that, it also allows me to eat it in really small portions and just say, how did that resonate with me? Was that worth, what can I do? What can I take from that? What can I learn from that? And again, I'm not saying that this is how everyone should read a nonfiction book. My point being is that that's the difference that can happen when we know why we're doing it versus simply Omar prescribing the act of reflection for the sake of reflecting. I think that's a really important framing that you've provided here, that again, as you go on your walk, for instance, you're reflecting on that walk in a way where I'm assuming that by the end of that walk, you've moved the needle in some way, shape, or form in terms of something that you were considering before you set foot on that walk.
Totally. And I think that those are that intentionality that it brings to think things through. Again, I think from an aspect of, I always look at it as like the most important thing when you're doing this self-reflection is not to be critical. So you're not doing it to, like, it's easy for it to spiral in a negative direction where you're like, why did I do this? Why did I think that? Whatever else. So one of the things I learned is like, hey, move aside the whys, don't dig. This is not like an incident report of some kind that you're writing and trying to find out like what was the root cause. It's really about just understanding yourself better and seeing what you can learn from any given situation. How does it link to maybe past situations or future situations that you're in? And it just helps set that intentionality. And I think that, again, I feel like this kind of activity has never been as relevant, just given how much exposure we have to inputs every day, like whether from our phones, our device, like everything. It's just you're being consistently bombarded. You really need that. You need to be intentional about creating that mental space, I think, more so than ever.
Yeah. And the reflect to self-understand is such a critical piece in this. I mean, you couldn't hit the nail on the head better. Like, that is something I am all too familiar with in high performance. And this is a warm audience when it comes to high performance, let's put it that way. And something that has to be emphasized, as Omar has just said there, and I want to underline it here, is this is not the time to point fingers. This is not the blame game. That is not what reflection is for. And as high performers, we're great at finding the one thing that could have been done better.
Exactly.
And then just beating ourselves over the head at it.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, like I'm trying to build an understanding, and I don't get any understanding by attacking myself. That is not how I form understanding, And so like that is such a powerful insight, just to simply explain further, like, this is how reflection can serve you. It can help you better understand yourself. And if you can find a piece that's why you're doing it, you should be able to avoid that temptation to fall into those holes of, again, finding that one thing and beating yourself over the head with it time and time again.
Totally.
Yeah. And so something I would love to learn from you as we start to wrap this up is when I think about the way in which you sustain yourself on this journey. And again, we've hit all four parts of your initial answer to that first question. Sustainability, and you alluded to something there in that last response around things being more important now than ever, and burnout is more prevalent than ever.
Yeah,
and you've talked about that a little bit here today. How have you found the most effective way for you is to sustain what you've sustained here in the last 20, 25 years of your career? Because again, we were joking right before we got started here, like, oh, it's been a week. It's been a week. We got a lot going on.
Yeah.
And yet here we are having a conversation. It's almost 8:00 at night where you are, and the energy and the excitement that you have for what we're talking about is prevalent. There's no sign of fatigue. There's no sign. Like, again, we may shut off the recording and you're going to collapse on the desk for all I know. But all I'll say is like that sustainability comes through in abundance with you, Omar. So just talk to our listeners a little bit about what maybe some of these practices are, or how your view on sustainability has simply, evolved over the years.
No, I appreciate that. And I think for me, a couple of elements that surface to the top there. I think the first one is like just starting with the basics of physical self-care. And I learned this one kind of the hard way is, our bodies get put through a lot, even though I'm not like doing high performance sports or doing, like physical labor or anything like that, but just the acts of, sitting long hours in a chair, whether in meetings or at my desk or whatever else, and just taking the stress and its effect on even like your muscles and everything else. So for me, like taking care of like your body is something that through the years has quickly moved to like number one in my books in terms of everything from like what I eat, exercise, sleep, like all these elements. I'm very intentional about those because they do play a role. Again, even though we may think that, hey, I'm not like an athlete or anything, but I feel like they're just as valuable for corporate longevity as ever, I think. So that's maybe one. I think the second one is, again, taking care of our mental well-being. It's important, whatever works for us. Like for some people, maybe it's journaling, maybe for others, it's talking to a therapist. But I think the fundamental element there for me is like connection and relationships. And so how do you build a support network, both within your workplace, but also obviously with your family, with your friends, etc. Because I think they're an incredible source of both energy, support, and help you in many ways that you don't even realize in that respect. So that would be kind of the second pillar. And the third pillar, I think we already covered in terms of linking what you do to fulfillment and purpose. Because I think that's what energizes you. Like just giving specifics, like on this conversation that we're having, I feel like it's coming from that energy is coming from that deep source that you're in. You feel like you could keep doing this for hours, no matter, as you said, like how tough a week it's been or how long of a week it's been. So those are three elements I would say, like physical well-being, kind of take care of our mental health and really building our relationships and connection. And the third one is linking what we do to, fulfillment and purpose, I feel are the three elements that really help me.
Yeah, it's wonderfully encouraging to hear that someone who has had the career that you've had can get to this point, and it wasn't as though you just kind of gave us three and said at any order. You actually said, I think number one for me, it is my body, it is my health. I do prioritize that, and it is something on this show that I am not embarrassed or shy to say that is the way I believe it should be done. I'm okay kind of standing on a mountain and planting my flag on the ground in that, is that, our health is our driving factor when it comes to our ability to perform. And that was the word I wanted to use with you too, is that this really is about performance. The sooner we start looking at what we do as performance, again, we may not be running fast, we may not be swimming fast or throwing anything far or anything like that physically. But once we look at this through that lens of performance, we start to realize the value of everything that you just presented there, like the body, the mind, and the why in the work that we do. It truly does impact performance at the end of the day.
Totally. And it impacts this sustainability more than anything. And as you said, like, especially when it comes to career, like this is a long journey. And so again, it's like you want to make sure that you're able to sustain, and actually in some ways it's the reverse. Is like, you need your best performance as you move in your career, because your responsibilities and the scope and the impact that you have is much, much larger in that respect. So you want to make sure that you're building up that capacity as you move forward. I think is very important. Yeah.
That's such a great word, capacity. It does tie into that sustainability. If we don't have the capacity to take on what's coming with that next step, that next level that we're moving up to, sustainability becomes so much more difficult, and so just to acknowledge that each step of the way comes with the need for greater capacity and the need to therefore respect so many of these principles that you're speaking to as well. Before I give you a chance to let our listeners learn a little bit more about where we can, connect with you and all that kind of thing, Omar, something that I know you're so passionate about when I look at some of the work that you put out publicly is just simply helping people know if they're on the right path.
Yeah.
Get that confirmation, like, hey, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing, or is this the path that I need to be on? What might be some parting words that you would provide our listeners just to sort of maybe find time to take stock and really find that assurance that, hey, am I actually on the right path?
Absolutely. I think the one advice I would give in this area is really the realization that there is no singular path. And so I think for me, like, while it may sound simple, I think it's quite profound in terms of, like, we always think of, like, hey, there's some path that you may have in your mind to say, like, hey, that's the ideal path. And in any way, shape, or form, I need to follow that path. But again, it's rarely that way. Again, a lot of, when we look at careers, even when I look at my own career, like, it's easy to look in hindsight and kind of connect the dots in the past, but things are not in some sense as clear or as forward visible as they may appear to be. So rather than obsessing about, like, am I in that trajectory, it's really about, what am I doing now? What are the things that I'm working on that are helping me grow? So focusing on those elements, like, this podcast is all about growth. I think focusing that element of, like, how am I getting better? How am I growing? And as long as you're doing that, again, you're building that momentum, you're building that, forward capacity. And as you do that consistently and over time, it will compound, and the clarity around the path will emerge as you take those actions. So I think sometimes, again, we maybe over obsess on the path, but a lot of times, like, the path emerges and that clarity emerges with the actions we take. And sometimes, yes, the action we take may uncover to us that we're going down a path that we don't actually maybe find fulfillment in or enjoy or whatever else. But as with anything in life, like, it's a choice, right? And at that point, through your actions, you can determine that, hey, this path is no longer serving either who I want to be or who I am or what I enjoy doing, and I want to pivot. But let action sort of guide. I think thinking is good, but only to a certain extent. So don't overthink it in that respect. Get doing and let that shine the clarity for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So you heard it there, folks. As opposed to following the path or creating the path, just follow the emerging path.
Yeah.
Follow the emerging path. And I think that's a wonderful insight and a wonderful way to capture so much of what we've discussed in this episode as well. And I just thank you for all of that, Omar. Before I let you go, where can we learn more about Omar and maybe even find ways to connect with you too?
Definitely. The best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. Just search my name. I post daily on the topics of leadership, management, and career growth. Send me a connect request. Happy to engage.
Yeah, love it. And all that information will be in the show in the show notes. And Omar, I just can't thank you enough for the generosity, the insights, the time. Again, especially end of the week, late at night where you are. But I'm just thankful that we've been able to connect, that you've been able to bring such quality to this episode, and that now I get to just watch from afar as you continue to be of value to so many, whether it be on LinkedIn or within your world, and just continue to wish you the best of luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you, Steve. Truly appreciate having the opportunity to both meet you virtually and speak on this podcast. Thanks a lot.
And my thanks again to Omar for joining us on the episode today. Such a wonderful conversation. We immediately joked once we pressed stop that that just absolutely flew by. I'm curious if it was like that for you as the listener too. It's such powerful insight from a person that has clearly experienced a lot, but also been responsible for other folks that are going through so much growth in their own respective journeys as well. Something that is so important for me to reinforce, and trust me, it is hard to pick one thing just to simply highlight and say this is the thing I'm going to take away. So I don't want you to hear it as like this is the only thing I'm taking away from this episode, but there is something that needs to be emphasized that we talk about probably once in every 4 or 5 episodes. And it's that notion of fulfillment. It's understanding that fulfillment is something that can be measured. It's not an absolute. We talked a lot about spectrums within the discussion, and I really encourage you to create some sort of fulfillment spectrum to ask yourself where would you lie. Let's just make it super simple on a scale of 1 to 10. How fulfilled are you right now in the work that you're doing? And if that number is any lower than, let's say, a 7, I would maybe encourage you just to sit and ask why. Just to sit with that and just do some thought around that and say, okay, if I were to improve fulfillment in my work, if I were to find more fulfillment in my life, where might I start? Where might I start with that? And just get curious. We talked about curiosity as well within the discussion. Like, get curious and ask yourself, what can I maybe start to change or include or remove, dare I say it, in order to find greater fulfillment in what I do each and every day. So just sit with that and think about it. And again, if you are someone who considers themselves to be 7, 8, 9, 10 on the fulfillment scale, then great, wonderful. But I also, as a coach, would always encourage you to similarly just ask why. And then secondly, step into the curiosity of how do I ensure that this remains to be the case? How do I ensure that I can protect that number so that I don't slowly lose fulfillment? Because again, as Omar alluded to, is that there are certain ways as our careers grow, we can start to become less and less aware of certain aspects. And the last thing I'd ever want for you to do is to assume that you're operating at a 7, 8, 9, 10 fulfillment and then go an entire year without really checking in and asking how fulfilled you are and finding that you've fallen down that scale. So always work to be done on either side of the scale, no matter where you find yourself. Awesome content, awesome discussion with Omar. So thankful for the time. And as always, thankful for you. Thankful that you took the time to stop by, to listen to this episode. And if you are new to the show, welcome. I'd love for you to give us a review on your way out, but also make sure you're sharing and most importantly, subscribing so you no longer miss out on the show. For my avid listeners, I appreciate you continuing to always stick around. But as always, know that we are not selfish and we should be sharing this content with anyone and everyone in our world that could stand to be impacted from this discussion today. But either way, best of luck with anything and everything going on in your world at the moment. I look forward to doing this again with you all very soon. Bye for now.
Thank you for tuning in to Growth Ready. If you liked what you heard and are feeling ready to grow, be sure to leave a 5-star rating, subscribe to the show, and share the episode with someone you know is ready to fuel their growth journey today. We love our community, so don't hesitate to reach out to us at podcast@growthready.com. And until next time, we are Growth Ready, and you will be too.